Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. And this is going to be sort of fast paced. So we're going to get into this pretty quick, but hopefully you'll be able to catch what we're saying and talking about. There's that box that keeps popping up at the top of my screen that I don't know how to get rid of. Hide video panel. I don't know. I'll leave it alone. Um, these creeks and rivers are majestic things. They say that only about 3% of the land area in Texas is made up of riparian areas. So you buy 100 acres, maybe only up to 3 acres of it could be creeks or rivers. But we buy land a lot of times for that riparian area. That's what we look for. And there was a wise Texan about 70 years ago who made this statement: saving the water and the soil must start where the first raindrop falls. This was made by our 36th president, Lyndon B. Johnson. He's a rancher, or was a rancher. You can still visit the family ranch, administered now by the National Park Service outside of Johnson City. And although we're going to talk about the creeks and rivers, we've also got to remember that water starts where the raindrops falls, and it often falls on the uplands. So that's a concern and a consideration for having good, healthy creeks, is having healthy uplands. I like to start off asking, do you have love, respect, and admiration for the land? And most people do that have this land and take care of it. This rancher from Abilene is an excellent steward of the land. He's looking at the seeds coming out of this flower head of Leavenworth Oringo. And if you look at an enlargement of this area right here, those seeds have little white straws coming out of the back of them, almost like a dinosaur, like the back of a dinosaur. Very unusual seeds. And we were talking about that when we were out there. This gentleman is looking, you can see in the background some recent brush control, some cedar has been pushed. And he's seeing some plants now that maybe he didn't recognize before. So he's understanding the land a little bit better. And how well do you understand your land? They say that there's an anonymous quote: the best fertilizer for a piece of land is the footsteps of the owner. And that's true. Now we're going to talk about riparian areas. We're going to get into hydrology 101. So our first question is, what happens to rainfall when it hits the ground? And in the normal world, where you were out in the audience and we were talking from up in front, I'd ask the question and you could holler it out. But in this case, I'll give you the answer. The raindrop is either going to soak in if it lands in some good vegetation, or it's going to run off if it falls on bare ground, cropland, or plowed up areas that are not vegetated. This is called a fence line contrast photo, looking right down this fence. It's just a sheep and goat fence, 48 inches tall. It's not a deer-proof fence. It's not one of the tall ones. But if you look on this side of the fence and you look over here, this fence might actually be a little blue stem proof fence, because we don't see it on this side. But you're seeing two different landowners and the way they treat their land. The one on the left is grazing quite responsibly, leaving quite a bit of vegetation. The one on the right, grazing a little bit harder. Let's look now at what the weight of these raindrops. Here's a raindrop landing on bare soil. Gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. 1 acre inch of water, which is an inch of water spread out over an acre, or about a football field, that's 27,000 gallons. Multiplied out, 226,000 pounds, or 113 tons of weight of that water hitting the soil. So when that raindrop falls over here and it lands in this little blue stem clump, it's going to have to slide down that stem, probably going to have a few more raindrops help push it on down. Then it's going to get to the leaves. Then it's going to get down to the litter and organic matter. And it'll eventually soak into the soil and become down into the soil profile. A raindrop that falls over here, where this grass is a half inch to no more than an inch in height, it's going to rapidly start breaking up that topsoil, and it's going to start exploding. And when I say exploding, when that raindrop hits that saturated soil and it explodes like a bomb, and it dislodges soil particles. And you see these little drops, that's sand and clay particles in suspension in the water. And now it can be floated off and goes downstream, gets into your creeks, into our rivers as sediment. So that's, a negative side of having too many animals, too much livestock grazing. Could be too many exotic animals as well, deer. But two different ways of looking at land management. Now, here's another question I usually ask is, this area bounded by this dashed line, what do we call that? All the rain that falls inside of the dashed line is collected and comes out at this one location. We know it as a watershed, but there are people in other countries, continents, or countries, Australia, New Zealand, they're starting to look at this area and they don't want to call it a watershed where all the water sheds off. They're calling it a water catchment. They're trying to capture and hold the water where it falls, much like Lyndon B. Johnson was saying. And when I started working out at Snyder many years ago, an old cotton farmer who was also a soil and water district board director, he had cropland, lots of terraces and waterways, and he kept them up. He plowed up the terraces every year. And he said, I want to catch every drop of water that falls on my land to grow more cotton. And he was doing it with those terraces. And he said, in addition, all the water that comes off my fields, comes off my neighbor's fields that are up the hill from me, I'm willing to take it and use it too. So he was trying to have a water catchment. Now we see this photo, another fence line contrast, two different landowners. One still thinking in terms of a watershed, and one has caught on to this idea that if you leave a little more grass out there, it slows the water runoff, soaks it into the ground, and it grows more grass. You're actually making more grass for the livestock by grazing less of it, by rotating and having a proper stocking rate. So as water flows down a creek, if we think of the straight section of a creek, there's actually two corkscrews of water, the path of the water. It's one corkscrew is clockwise, one's counterclockwise, and they're going together like this. And in the middle of the creek, you may see a slight upwell of the water, very slight, almost like the crown of a football field, higher in the middle than it is near the sidelines. And that's the way it flows in a straight section. When the creek comes to a turn, the corkscrew that's on the outside of that bend assumes dominance. And now both of the corkscrews are turning just like this, and they're eroding that bank. And then somewhere downstream at the next curve, on the inside of the next curve, this soil that is now in suspension in the water will be deposited. And that forms the point bar, or the inside bend of a creek. The point bar that's formed here is sediment that was dislodged way back upstream, somewhere over here in another outside bend. So that's what a cut bank starts out as this water erosion caused by the circulatory path of that water. So a creek has one simple job. All it does is transport water and sediment. That's all. But it's very important to the health of that creek and how it can transport that. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Here's a creek running, well, we've got two hills on either side of a valley. And this valley is right here in the middle. And this valley length is 10,000 feet, straight line distance. Hill on either side, water running toward the middle. At the top of the hill over here, at top of the valley, it's elevation of 1,600 feet. Down here, even though it looks like it's going uphill, down here, it's 1,500 feet. So it's dropped 100 foot in elevation. If you divide 100 into this valley length, 100 foot of elevation into this length of 10,000, you get a 1% grade. That's fairly fast water. That would erode very quickly. That's probably twice the 2 to 3 times actually the grade of most of our creeks in the Blackland Prairie. So it's fast water. So that creek realizes that it needs to do something, and it will start creating meanders, zigzags, back and forth. It's flattening the slope. It's slowing down the water. Now this channel that's 14,000 feet, divide that into the 100, you get a grade of 0.7%. Instead of 1%, we're down to 0.7. And if that channel continues to lengthen and we get down into these bottomland Mississippi Delta type where the land really gets to meandering back and forth, we have a 25,000 foot channel in a 10,000 foot valley, and we're down to 0.4% slope. Really, that's kind of what we are in our Blacklands here. Actually, it's more like hill country creek. I'm sorry, hill country. But what happens if the creek senses that it's a little bit too slow? It needs now, instead of lengthening that valley, it needs to straighten the creek out a little bit, get a little more energy. It'll come along here and it'll cut across this spot right here. It'll leave this as an oxbow, and it'll just kind of be a oxbow lake on its own. That strengthens or increases the grade, makes the creek able to transport the water and sediment a little bit better. And it will look like this graph right here. When you flatten the creek, it's going to slow the water down. But when we need to speed it up, we would need to steepen the grade, and it can steepen the grade by cutting this section out right here, cutting that length out. This is an old balance beam developed by a gentleman named Mr. Emery Lane. He was a hydrologist, and he worked on this back in the 1950s. But here's how our creeks are operating right now. Very simple drawings. Here's a creek. Here's the floodplain on either side. This is the amount of water. If it's a perennial creek or a seasonal creek, it will have water most of the year. Seasonal creeks may go dry during the summer, and they'll start flowing again in the winter. Intermittent creeks are the ones that only flow as a result of snow or rainfall events. And the creeks that we're going to be talking about are the seasonal and the perennial that have contact with the water table underneath the creek. So this is base flow, what the creek flows most of the year. When we get a rain event, either right on the watershed where we're at or up watershed, and it comes down the creek, and when the water is just about to get to the top of this bank right here, that's a term, there's a term for it called bank full flow. And this bank full flow should happen on the average of about a 1.5 year interval. In other words, you should have water get up this high every 1.5 years. So floods are not bad to a creek. We're going to show you in a little bit more detail here. So this is the active floodplain on either side of the creek. And as the water continues to pour into that creek, it will spill out onto the active floodplain. We've got, because there's very little to slow the water down in the creek channel itself, that's high velocity water. But over here on the floodplain where you have vegetation, you may have rocks and trees, that's scrubbing energy off that water, slowing it down, and it causes the sediment that's in the water to drop out, which will build up the floodplain, make it even larger, and that's a good thing for a creek. So the floodplains dissipate the energy, trapping that sediment, just like what we see here. When the water gets up onto this floodplain here, all this vegetation is going to scrub that energy off. When the water slows down, it drops the sediment, it drops logs, it drops organic matter, it drops vegetation that will root and regrow, and it's feeding the creek. A flood feeds the creek because it brings that organic matter down, nutrients. It's actually a good thing. Now, maybe not good, gets in your house, but for the creek itself, it's a good thing. So here's that base flow again, and our water table under the soil, under the surface, is in contact with that water elevation and base flow. The water table is providing water to the creek. Then when we get a flood event, water will go back into the water table, and it enlarges that water table. Oftentimes you'll hear it called a riparian sponge because it's a give, it gives and takes. Right now, after a flood, the creek is giving water to the water table. And then during the hot, dry summer, the water table keeps the creek flowing by giving water back to the creek. Sometimes, though, we have problems with our creeks. This might be in urban areas due to a loss of vegetation. It could be due to construction upstream that dumps tremendous more water, from asphalt, concrete, roads, bridges, shopping centers, houses, everything that's impervious to water. The water keeps coming on down, and it can cut these creeks. Out in the rural countries, it happens a little slower, but it can happen out in the rural areas because of maybe a feedlot or a rock quarry, a gravel mine upstream, and it will create this, and overgrazing will too. It creates issues that puts extra water in the creek, and it will continue to down cut until it reaches some equilibrium, and then it will start widening. And this is a nasty looking phase right here. You can't stop it. It's hard to do anything with it. You can't stop it economically, I'll say. But at some point, it's going to sort of balance itself with the amount of water that's coming in, and it's going to stay there at that level, right, like that. But this is where we were, and now we have lost. We're down to here now. We've lost all of this soil from our creek, and now we've got a deep, wide, I don't want to call it a ditch, but it's a lot deeper and wider than it used to be. So excessive erosion enlarged this channel to this size right here. Happens very commonly. And out in rural areas, it can look like this. And we like to point out the vegetation being very important to the health of a creek. Look on the right-hand side at all the trees. Notice that the creek is not cut back near as far over here where all this tree and diversity of vegetation is. On this side, there was probably one row of trees. You can see a few. They bulldozed just as close as they could get to that creek and put in Bermuda grass. And the Bermuda grass could not withstand the flood events. And so it's eroding more on this side than it is on the right. But that's the down-cutting and widening phase. And like I said, it's a nasty looking creek for a little while. So as we go through from our normal creek with the water table up like this to that down-cut creek, what happens to the water table? It shrinks. It goes down because it's no longer, there's no more water up here because it's all down deep in this hole right here. The water table shrinks. Down cutting of the creek drains the water table. So plants that used to be riparian plants that had their roots in water up here on the banks, they're dead now because their roots are too far from the water table to survive. So we've lost riparian vegetation up here on the creek banks. Here's that base flow again, bankful flow from our normal size creek. When the creek begins to enlarge and it gets that same amount of water that used to come up to right here, that water now is captured all the way down here in this deep channel. And that contributes to the deepening and the widening. You can see that this channel right now, it could hold twice the amount of water down in this channel and still not get out on the floodplain. So this is what this contributes to that erosion, having it trapped down in the channel and losing access to the floodplain. And we get ditches that look like this. For scale, this dirt clod right here was about the size of a refrigerator. And where does all this soil go? It goes downstream. This is in Bell County, so this is going to go to the Brazos River and dump into the Brazos. A lot of good topsoil lost. But look at the vegetation. Look how short it is. That's a contributing factor. Something happened right here that created a head cut, and that head cut came up this creek. And I don't have the other photos. We show it during the other workshop. That's the 3-hour workshop. And you can see some concrete helped to stop this head cut right here. Here's another head cut out in the pasture. Here's the creek going up this way, pretty good slope on it. And this head cut, you might call it a waterfall. Looks kind of pretty, but that waterfall is creating erosion that's causing the creek to widen and deepen. And it's going to continue walking up that creek until it hits something hard. Mother Nature provides ledge rock, solid ledges of rock, or boulders big as a vehicle, rocks big as a bushel basket, something like that will slow this head cut down. Man-made objects, maybe a bridge, concrete foundation of a bridge might stop a head cut. Here's a small head cut in a forest in East Texas. Notice that the original shape of the creek was just right here, pretty narrow and not overly deep. But look at now, it's dropped 2 more feet down, and all the erosion that's happening undercutting this vegetation. It's all now falling in, widening, and deepening. Does this happen only with deep soil creeks, or can it happen on a rock bottom creek like we have in the hill country? And we have some of these in the North Texas as well, with creeks with a rock layer. Here's the base flow, bank full flow, and here's when it's in flood stage, water out on the floodplain. There's our water table perched on top of the rock, a perched water table. You might have heard that phrase. So it's a water table that's either perched on rock or heavy enough clay that the water can't seep through it. But now the water is giving back to the water table through the flood, and that's healthy, enlarging that riparian sponge. And it keeps our creek flowing year round because of that riparian sponge giving water up to the creek. Water table sustains the base flow. And this is what you might have, something like this. Here's that little creek channel. All of this area right in here is part of that riparian sponge. If we were to come over right here and dig a hole with a sharpshooter, get down to that depth, water would start seeping in because that riparian sponge is underneath. So here's that rock ledge creek. Something happens to it, maybe some mining upstream, quarry goes in, overgrazing goes in, construction on the edge of town starts, and the creek starts down cutting. It can only down cut till it hits that rock. Can't go any further, but it starts widening. And it will widen until it reaches that equilibrium again. We don't know what that is. The creek determines that equilibrium. And when it's happy, it will stop widening. But now our riparian area is just 2 little narrow bands on either side, and we lost this much riparian area as well as this much soil. So that's a drawback too. You know, that's not a healthy thing. It's not what you bought the land for, but it happens. So the over widening channel reduced the riparian sponge, and it will look like this. It's cut it down to rock. You don't see any riparian sponge. This is right going into the upland right here. And over here, we see some gravel, softball sized rocks that were not able to be transported down the creek. Remember, a creek or a river transports water and sediment. But if the creek becomes overly widened and shallow, it loses the energy it takes to push that rock on down the system. And we start getting, rock piles, mid-channel bars. Mid-channel bar means kind of like a sandbar, but it's out in the middle of the channel. It's not a healthy spot to be. The channels, those point bars and sandbars need to be on the sides. Here's an old part of the floodplain right here. But what can happen over time, and it takes small rain events that'll push a little water down the creek. Well, let me back up. I was getting ahead of myself. So there's the base flow, bank full flow, and we can't transport that water. This is probably a better photo to illustrate that. Look how this is part of the Nueces River down in South Texas, Southwest Texas. Look at the how wide and shallow. It's only a couple of inches deep, and it can no longer support the transport of this rock. And you look over here and it looks like lava flows pushed up against those trees. That's from the big major bank to bank flood events. But the smaller rains, smaller flood events can't push the gravel through this anymore. But over time, Mother Nature will try to heal this. And this is not, the color blue probably isn't the right color here, it ought to be brown. This is sediment that gets deposited. Fast water is still in the middle of the channel, and on the outer side, right at the corners, you get some sediment deposit. We're still getting a little erosion off these vertical banks, so we're getting some deposits from there as well. And you go another few months, maybe another rain event, a little bit more sediment gets deposited. Maybe another year goes by, a little more sediment's deposited. At this point right here, if a flash flood comes through, it's going to strip it all out. We're back to zero. But the creek will then pick up and start healing again, and it will take it back and it'll add a little sediment. And now we have a new channel built down in the bottom of this overly widened channel, and it sort of mimics the channel that originally was there, but it's down lower in elevation now, and all of that riparian vegetation that was up here is still dead. But now we're growing riparian vegetation on either side of the new floodplain. And our water table is built back up a little bit. It's now connected to this water right here, or to the water in the bottom of the creek, and it will sustain a base flow again. And it might look like this. This is also down in that Nueces River country, a different creek, but look at the vertical banks. And right here against the toe, right in this area, is where the first sediment gets deposited. Maybe a few big rocks that can't roll, they stay there, and they're sort of acting like energy scrubbers for the water, causing sediment to drop out. Vegetation will then grow. And as it grows, it gets larger and larger, like I showed, and eventually it will heal back over and it will look like this. Here's that same drawing we did down in an actual creek. The creek used to be, this used to be floodplain. Now it's an abandoned floodplain. And now the creek is down here, and this is the new floodplain, new active floodplain. So it has rebuilt itself down in that lower elevation. The way that we can help the creek do that is to try and remove whatever the problem was that created that erosion in the first place. If it's overgrazing, you can change that. If it's a mining operation upstream, that may be a little harder to do anything about. If it's construction at the edge of town, they're probably not going to pull up that concrete and asphalt. So, it makes it a little harder for those creeks in urban areas. And on the rock-lined creeks, it works the same way. Starts on the edges, works in, gets a little bit, and then say a big flood comes along, blows it back. Well, the creek, like I said earlier, just picks up, starts back in, building it back up. And eventually we've got a new channel and we've got the water table. And this is kind of what we're building: soil on top of rock. You can't see the rock, it's under the water here. You see some ledgy rock back here and here. But this is now beginning to heal and build up the soil. It'll actually rebuild the soil on top of that rock. Here's a photo from the hill country. Makes you wonder if this will ever be healed. You see no riparian floodplains. If the creek had its mind and had a little help from man, it would develop a kind of a meandering channel, and then it would rebuild sediment on both sides of the creek, rebuilding the floodplain down here a little bit lower. But look on each bank up here, both sides. Look how the grazing is. Unless the grazing changes, this creek's not going to get a chance to heal. So if it's grazing by lawnmowers, grazing by axis deer, grazing by cattle, sheep, and goats, it all contributes to having too much runoff and not enough stabilizing vegetation, upland vegetation and riparian vegetation. So we've got a properly functioning definition here that we want to go over. Properly functioning riparian area will be an area that will have adequate vegetation, landform. This would be ledge rock or boulders or large logs laying down in the creek that get buried, and it'll have some or all of these. We're going to mainly next talk about the vegetation. In order to dissipate the energy of the floodwater, vegetation can do that. Reduce erosion, but not eliminate it, but reduce it. Stabilize the banks of the creeks. Trap sediment in the floodplains. Develop these floodplains. Provide floodwater retention in the floodplain, getting it down into the groundwater, and providing water storage in the banks and the floodplains. All of that can be done with vegetation, landform, and large logs, or you don't often have all three, but we nearly always have vegetation. So let's cover that. If you're a rancher, and this is how I usually present this in an in-person presentation, you look around, see the ranchers in the crowd, they got them straw hats on. And, I'll ask them, what type of vegetation do you look for on a riparian area? And they're going to say grasses, because that's what feeds their cattle, their sheep, goats. Wildlife person, you ask them the same question, they're going to look at the forbs, the shrubs, and trees, because that provides the food and cover for wildlife. But what are these cats right here? Sedges and rushes. Who's managing for those? The creek is. The creek prefers these sedges and rushes because these are the ones most adapted to living with wet feet, wet roots. Some of these other plants can too. We need to talk about the functional groups of riparian plants. We've got colonizers and stabilizers. And among the stabilizing plants, there are both herbaceous, grassy, forb type, and woody stabilizers. So the colonizers, after a rainfall event and we have a flood event, sediment's been deposited, the colonizer plants are the first ones to get roots down in this freshly deposited soil or gravel or sandbars. First plants on the scene. They spread by both stolons and rhizomes. The problem is they're generally weaker rooted plants. They're not able to stay through a follow-up flood, but it's critical that they get there and get their roots in to help hold that first batch of sediment that's deposited. Here's a couple of examples. Waterhead, this is one we don't normally see on true creeks. It's more of a wetland plant, but it's a colonizer. Water primrose is one we do see a lot on riparian areas, and look at it. It's making an above ground runner, stolon, growing right out in the water. What's interesting, look at these leaves. During the early growth in the summer, they're spoon-shaped, oval-shaped. But as that water primrose matures and begins to flower, look at the leaves. They have elongated, come to a point, and their keeled are boat-shaped, like Maximilian sunflower leaves are. Here's a giant ragweed, another colonizer. You can look for ragweed when you see this three-lobed leaf. That's a good clue. And what we have down here that looks a little like a fine stem grass is actually a spike rush. We'll talk more about it. Now the stabilizers are stronger, more heavily rooted plants, often deep fibrous root systems and rhizomatous root systems that enable them to get a toehold and get an anchor, and they're harder to be washed out by the next flood. They begin to provide bank protection and dissipate the energy of the floodwater going out on the floodplain. And like I said earlier, there's herbaceous, grassy, forb type stabilizers and woody stabilizers. This plant right here, Indigo bush amorpha, growing right out in the water, it's telling you it likes to be with wet roots. So it's a definite kind of a mid-range stabilizer. Here's a sycamore, definitely a stabilizer. It's got upright trunks to help catch vegetation. It's got roots under the soil. This was stripped away, and you can see the roots are exposed, but it's still holding, still helping to protect that bank. And then sometimes our herbaceous plants will have switchgrass, which is a very strong stabilizing plant. It'll work together with spike rush, which is kind of a combination colonizer slash stabilizer. It's better than most colonizers, but it's not a true stabilizer. But when you work together like this, it strengthens that little island right there where those plants are growing. It's going to be hard to wash that out. There's 5 wetland indicator categories, from the wettest being obligate wetland to the driest, which we're not too concerned about with our riparian areas, obligate upland. Facultative wet and facultative upland are exactly opposite. And then facultative is plants that are equally likely to be in the wet as the dry areas. Let's go into a little more detail. So the wettest side, OBL, obligate wetland, 99% of the time, you're going to see those plants down in the riparian areas where there's water on the roots, or they'll be in wetlands 99% of the time. Now, the next slightly drier category is the facultative wetland, FACW plants. 66 to 99% of the time, they'll be in a riparian area slash wetland. but up to a third of the time, they may be on an upland site in a non-wetland. And then the facultative equally as likely to be in a wetland or riparian area as a non-wetland. The plants that we like to contend ourselves with and concentrate on are the facultative, fac-wet, and obligate, the three wetter categories, because those are the plants that we need growing down on that riparian area. As we get a little bit drier, facultative upland, notice that the percentage is exactly opposite of facultative wetland. Now it's 66 to 99% of the time you're going to be growing in a non-wetland, non-riparian area, but still up to a third of the time they can be in that riparian area. And then the driest category is the upland, obligate upland, 99% of the time not going to be found in a wetland, but we've got one or two that sure like to be down there a little more than we give them credit for. I'll show you which one that is later. We also need to talk about the stability ratings of these plants. And there's a handout that was emailed out to some of you. The ones that register later this afternoon, you'll get an email showing where to get that handout. Just a one-page front and back listing of some plants. And this scale was originally developed by a gentleman named Al Windward in Arizona. And he developed this rating for the plants out there. We've taken it, brought it to Texas and adapted it to our plants. And the scales from 1 to 10 with a plant that had a score of 1, which we don't have any that low, but that's on this scale, that would mean that that plant is equal to the stability of bare ground, no better than bare ground. On the other hand, a plant that had a score of 10, and we don't have any 10s currently, maybe 1 or 2 of the 9s probably ought to be 10s, but the 10 would be equal to the stability of anchored rock or large anchored logs. And on most of the creeks in the Edwards Plateau, the hill country that have greater than 0.3% slope, high gradient streams, we would like to see a majority of the stabilizing woody plants to score a 7 or greater. In the Blackland Prairie, I'm just saying Blackland Prairie because it fits this low gradient stream, less than 0.3% slope. We can get by with these woody plants that score a 6, and we'll take 7s and 8s as well. But you need at least a 6 to have a stable riparian area. So let's look at this photo and look at the functional groups. Right here in this moist mud, fresh deposit mud, that's the colonizer plants. They're doing their job. That's where they need to be. Up here where there's some old sediment and older established plants, we've got some herbaceous stabilizers and we've got a woody stabilizer right there. You put the wetland indicator category on there. Look at the obligate, OBL, 99% of the time it's going to be growing with its roots in water. That one is. Here's another obligate. Here's a facultative. Equally likely to be in the water is on the uplands. And this woody plant's a FAC-W. So it's about 66 to 99% of the time you're going to find it in the wetlands. But the names and the stability ratings begins to make a little sense. Watercress, it's an introduced plant, has a weak rooted score of 3, but it's doing its job on that fresh mud. And look up here, some of our strong stabilizers. Emery sedge scores a 9, switchgrass a 9, and black willow a 7. So that's how we can use this rating. And you got to know your plants, but the plants are talking to you. They're telling you, I like to be near the water. If they've got a score of 8 or 9, they want to have those roots wet. Watercress, even though it scores, well, I'm confusing stability rating and the wetland indicator, but the wetland indicator tells us that watercress is an obligate. So it likes to be near the water. This is an obligate right here, and this was a facultative and fac-wet. So the plants are telling us that they can stand the water when they're that wet of a wetland category. Here's frog fruit. It's a stabilizing plant on the weak side, scoring a 4, and it's facultative. It's trying to crack that rock open with the roots, and you see it spreads with above ground runners. Everywhere there's a set of leaves, there'll be a set of roots come out. So it's forming a netting of stolons running across the ground, across that mud. Here's spike rush. Everything you can see in this photo basically is spike rush. And there was a recent minor flood event that came through and stripped away the spike rush off this little spot of soil right here. But that's all right. It'll come back. It's got rhizomes. It'll spread. That's the function. These plants are adapted to withstand quite a bit of erosion of water force. Sometimes they'll strip away a little bit and they'll grow right back. Everything you can see in this photo that's tall behind this hat, that's knotgrass. It's a kind of a transitional colonizer slash stabilizer. It's a fact wet plant. Everything you see in front of that hat that's short, that's also knotgrass. These are the above ground stolons that are running out here onto this fresh mud and trying to colonize slash stabilize it. And it does a good job. Here it is on a newly built lake up in Munster. Notice the water. This is the knotgrass right here with the runners. Notice the water's dropping in the lake, and the knotgrass runners are following the water. They're chasing the water, and they'll chase it all the way out into the water, and they can continue to grow out in the water. And they have a seed head like that V for victory sign from World War II. So if you see that seed head out in the water, that's knotgrass. Broadleaf wood oats, you may have learned this as inland sea oats, but surprisingly, plants change names every so often. Botanists have a lot to do with that. But this is a colonizer, facultative, can grow wet, can grow in the dry. Score of 5. It likes to be in the shade. So if you've got a heavy shaded area in your yard, then you have trouble with anything growing, you can probably grow this as long as there's a little dappled shade, dappled sun getting through. And you notice as it matures, the seed heads bow over, and down in South Texas, the landowners down there call it fish on a pole. And you can kind of see where it gets that name. Here's water willow. This spreads by underground rhizomes. It's a stabilizing obligate with a score of 8, and very, very nice plant. Good for pollinators, beautiful flowers, all around good plant. Cattle will eat this plant in drought years. When the water goes down in the creeks, the cattle, they'll eat this right down to the mud. Here is southern wild rice, a very robust grass. This was in the post oak savanna down in Limestone County. You can see it growing right out in the water. It's an obligate, so it likes the water. It scores a 9, very strong, very stable grass. Here it is in a little slough in Ellis County. It's between Ellis County and Navarre County, kind of right on the county line. On either side of this slough is Bermuda grass patch. And right in the middle of that Bermuda grass patch is this slough growing southern wild rice. And I took a sharpshooter and tried to dig one up, and it was digging in mud, you know, that old suction like mud. This is all the root I was able to get up, but I guarantee you there's probably 5 or 6 feet of root going down off each plant. I cut that one plant in half. This is the tailgate of the pickup I was in. So this is about 3.5 feet long. The top half of it is 4 feet long. So that grass was 7.5 feet tall. Scores a 9, very robust. It can withstand a lot of erosion on these creeks and rivers. So again, here's southern wild rice on the left. A smaller cousin to it, or a smaller like lookalike, is called rice cutgrass. This one will only get about 3.5 feet tall. And it's a stabilizer, obligate, scores a 5. It's not quite as strongly rooted as the southern wild rice, but it grows right out in the water. And it's a very common grass in the Edwards Plateau creeks and rivers. One of the best sedges to have, not grass, but sedges, is emery sedge. And you can identify emery sedge because of the way these leaves, they bow over. See how they've got that curvature? All those leaves bowing over. This is on the Brazos River in Palomino County. It's a strong stabilizer. It scores a 9. It's an obligate, and you can definitely see it's growing with wet roots right now. Here it is growing on the banks of a creek in any of the hill country counties in Edwards Plateau. Here it is growing in Kaufman County on a restored wetland. So it grows in the blackland prairies. Here it is growing on, I think it's called Bull Creek. It's on the DFW airport grounds, southwest side of the airport property. But this is it right here. There's a problem though. Look at how far down the water is. This creek is in a process of down cutting and widening. And it's now probably 8 or 10 feet from this plant. So this plant, I took this photo 7 or 8 years ago. This plant's probably dead now because the water is so far down, the roots cannot get to that water. And being an obligate, 99% of the time, it's got to have its roots wet. So it's probably not there. So when you down cut and widen, you lose some of those plants that were up here originally. Even on old family photos from the 1960s, like this photo from Salado Creek in Bell County, we can find emery sedge. You can also find Johnson grass, and you can see the water willow and the black willow and grapevines. So we can learn a lot about the plants from these old photos. What was on Salado Creek, what, 60 to 70 years ago? This is back to the Brazos River, just south of Palo Pinto, Possum Kingdom Lake. This is the Highway 16 bridge. It runs south of the dam about a mile and a half. And I've took this photo in May of 2008. Look at this patch of emery sedge right here. I put a couple of arrows just to give you some points to look at, but you could pick this point or that point or anywhere. We're going to go forward from May of 2008 to November 2008. Is your point still there? There's been some sand deposited. We go back, a little bit of sand there, a little more sand. What you don't see in between May and November is in July of that year, there was a major flood, put 6 feet of water over the entire width of that Brazos River. And they had all but one gate open in the dam, letting water flow 5 or 6 weeks right across that patch of emery sedge. So we go back and look at it before the flood, after the flood. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? But not everything stays the same. I wanted to go back in the February of 2019, a little over 10 years later, I went back and took that same photo. In fact, if you look right here, you can see this piece of pipe sticking out of the emery sedge, and right there it is. But if you look, that whole little island right there, maybe, we had some tremendous floods in 2015, 2016, bad erosion. And so it looks like some of that emery got washed out. Of course, this is a wintertime shot. I should go back and get it in the growing season, but this is switchgrass that has taken over right here, kind of coming in over the emery to take over. Let's go across the bridge now. Let's look over here. And this is before the flood. Look at the emery sedge right here. There's a little bit of sand deposits. And then all of this back here is a grass. Kind of hard to tell what it is just yet. After the flood, here's that emery sedge right along the banks of the Brazos. And there's a little bit more sand deposit. And all of this is switchgrass that we were seeing earlier. So that's protecting this floodplain down here. This is a very low floodplain that does get flooded over like you saw, but it's doing its job at protecting it. So if we look at switchgrass again, that's this tall grass right here, has a hollow stem. If you want to look for, you think you got switchgrass, cut the stem, and if it's hollow, that'll be switchgrass. Here it is growing. Since it's a facultative grass, not only can it grow right in the water, it can grow up on the dry prairies of Haskell County up in a grassland planting. Scores a 9, very stable grass. The most palatable grass a cow will ever wrap its tongue around is eastern gamma grass. Strong stabilizer, facultative, like switchgrass, and it scores a 9. Now, the neat thing about the switchgrass and the eastern gamma grass right now, this time of year, if you want to plant something to help jumpstart recovery on your creek, you can buy the seed of this switchgrass and eastern gamma grass you can go to your feed store and they're going to turn around and order it from Turner Seed in Breckenridge, or you can pick up the phone or order it online, I think, and you can call Turner Seed in Breckenridge and order that seed yourself. Some soil and water conservation districts that the NRCS works with also will order that seed and give you a little discount. But you can put that seed out right now in the moist mud and let it germinate and hopefully start growing. Eastern Gamma has male and female plant parts on the same stem. The male flowers are out here on the end, and down at the bottom part is where the green and now the ripened seeds are, the female part. So it also scores a 9. We've got 2 wild ryes. This is not ryegrass, but these are native, perennial, cool season wild ryes. Stabilizers, one's a 5, one's a 6. We look at some of the woody plants. Black willow scores a 7. These are all going to be stabilizers. This is a FAC wet. 66 to 99% of the time, we should see that willow growing along the creeks, and that's pretty common. We do. Cottonwood, stabilizer, FAC wet, scores a 6. This would work in the Blackland Prairie. Might not be enough in the Edwards Plateau. Might need some 7s and 8s and 9s to go with it. Sycamore, about the same thing, scores a 6. Bur oak. Now you see this gentleman standing right here. He's about 6 foot tall. That's a pretty good sized bur oak. This is down about a quarter mile away from Mill Creek, right on again the Navarra-Ellis County line. Here's the leaves. I know you're familiar with them. They'll be over a foot in length. The acorns big as a golf ball. Facultative, score of 6. And this is back on the DFW airport grounds, young seedling bur oaks. We like to see regeneration of these trees, not just old growth. We need some new growth and some middle-aged growth to take and be stable out there. Buttonbush, obligate, likes to be in the water, scores 7. Also very desirable from pollinator standpoint. Box elder maple, sometimes just called box elder, FAC wet, score of 6, all of it right here. The leaves kind of have a droopy appearance. Sometimes you might confuse them with poison ivy, but this will be a tree and not a vine. Scores a 6, FAC wet. Green ash, same thing, very common on our creeks. Rough leaf dogwood, facultative, scores a 6. American beautyberry, even though it's a woody, it's kind of thin limbed, skinny stems, so it only scores a 4. And it's a facultative upland. Only about a third of the time or less would you expect it to be down in that riparian area. And Osage orange, Bodark, horseapple, whatever you want to call it, upland. 99% of the time it will be growing in a upland and not a wetland. But how many times do we see this? This is a very common upland in our riparian areas. And you might ask, what causes a browse line on trees? There it is, grazing. Now, we're going to cover a series of photos over a 30-year period taken up in Oregon by this gentleman, Wayne Elmore. At the time, he was the lead of the National Riparian Service Team, which was a multidisciplinary team made up of range specialists, plant people, geomorphologists, and from different agencies, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Natural Resources Conservation Service, based out of Oregon. And he came down and gave training to us years ago, 20 years ago, on how these creeks can be restored. His photos are going to be taken in Central Oregon at about 3,500 foot elevation on the dry side of Oregon, 12-inch precipitation. Here's the first photo. Now, to set this up, in the 1950s, there was a species of black willow growing all up and down this section of Bear Creek, all over Bear Creek, all over Western Oregon, Western Washington, for that matter, on the riparian areas. And this was well before wildlife and way before pollinators ever got popular. It was all about livestock grazing. And this is not land owned by any person. It's owned by the Bureau of Land Management, BLM. No one had ever homesteaded this land. No one ever bought it. It wasn't good enough, and the government maintained ownership of it. But for over 100 years, it's been leased out to livestock grazers called permittees. And it's had 100 years of hard grazing. So they were the kind of the instigators to want to get this willow sprayed to grow more cowgrass, get more forage. So in the mid to late 1950s, miles and miles and miles of these creeks were sprayed to kill that willow species. In 1964, they had a 100-year flood event over a large chunk of this watershed. And those trees that had been sprayed in the mid to late 50s had died. The roots had shriveled up, shrank. The soil was, they weren't gripping the soil now. And when that 100-year flood come through, it stripped those trees out, washed them downstream, took topsoil and creek bank soil with it. And this is in 1977. This is still what is visible. Very little restoration. Now, this had been a blue ribbon trout stream, and there's the sum total of what you can see the water. It's washed it down to rock right here. So we've got to set the stage for this series of photos. This tree right here, which to me always looked like it had a hula hoop around it, Wayne Elmore called it the fat cedar. It'll be in every photo. And this snag right here will be in every photo. This line of evergreens right here, including this big one, were cut down after this first year. But this is sand sagebrush, so that's in the upland right there. So the riparian area is right down here, but it's washed down to rock, very little water. Notice this cut bank is still vertical. There's only been a little bit of layback of the slope and vegetation, just a little bit of vegetation starting to grow. So they realized they had to do something different if this creek was going to improve. So it had dropped down, becoming an intermittent stream, had been a perennial stream, had very accelerated erosion, 100 years of poor grazing management, which resulted in a poor vegetation. And as we go through these slides, every now and then, when you glance up here to find the hula hoop and the snag, look at the grass around it. The grass really doesn't change up here. Well, we want to monitor what changes down here. The riparian sponge area amounted to about 4 acres stretched out over a mile. And they were evaluating a reach, they call it, of 3.5 miles. The water storage was 1.5 acre feet per mile. So you take 1.5 football fields and stretch it out to a mile. That's not very much water storage. And out of that 3.5 miles, which is 19,000 feet, it had over 12,000 feet still of serious bank erosion 20 years after the trees were sprayed and 13 years after the flood. So 2/3 of the reach still had serious bank erosion. So what did they do to change this? They changed the grazing. From 1977 to 79, the permittee was told, take your cows off, no grazing. Of course, he was only paying probably 5 or 7 cents an acre for the land at the time. I'm sure he wasn't happy, but he was willing to go along with it if it would make it better in the long run. And then from 79 to 84, they said, okay, you can put some cattle back on here, but we want a reduced stocking rate, not as many animals, so we can jumpstart recovery of the creek. And then from 1985 through the present, it's been operated under a rotational grazing system so that pasture where this reach of the creek is, and these are huge 40, 50,000 acre pastures, mostly mountains, but this pasture only gets grazed during late winter. It has all spring, all summer and fall to grow vegetation. So what happened? All right, there's the hula hoop, there's the snag, there's the cut bank, but notice the cut bank has started to kind of heel over, very little vertical left, but whoa, what is this? We got water flowing again. And we got riparian vegetation growing on sand deposits. This is an improvement from 77 to 83. 3 years later in 86, now we're starting to get true riparian sedges, rushes, bulrushes, and some other riparian grasses growing down in here. Notice up high, not much changing on the vegetation, but this is certainly getting better. And something else to notice from back there, let's go back to 83. Look how wide the channel is right now. We go forward 3 years, the riparian area has increased, narrowing the channel. It's called narrowing up. So that's healthy. That's building that floodplain, increasing the riparian sponge. So from 86, they went back out there in June of 87. Looks like they had a little flood, didn't they? But look at all this mud. You can see footprints where they walked out in there. Was it a devastating flood? Well, let's see. June of 87 to August. Notice the creek is beginning to narrow back up. It's beginning to incorporate that sediment into the vegetation. To a creek, a flood is a good thing because it brings down sediment that has nutrients in it. It brings down plant parts, riparian plants that can become rooted, and it helps to strengthen the banks, enlarging the floodplain, improving the amount of water that's in that riparian sponge. So from August of 87 to probably early fall of the next year, look here, it's narrowed up a little bit more. We've got very healthy riparian vegetation, not much changed on the vegetation up here. That old permittee, he might be a little begrudgingly saying, okay, I kind of see a little improvement here. I'm going along with you now. 93, wait a minute, are we in the same spot? There's a hula hoop tree, there's the snag. Let's go back, let me show you one more. This plant right here, it's kind of in the shadow, but right there, that pyramid shaped plant, there it is. There's a snag, there's a hula hoop. So we're in the right spot, but where'd the creek go? Well, 1993 was a drought year. What happens to the water in a drought? The last bit of water will be in the middle of the creek channel. And where do the plant roots go during a drought? They grow toward that water. So they're growing under the creek channel, helping to strengthen that channel by forming like a mesh of roots underneath that channel. And it's just solid vegetation. 93, February of 96. Now this is a big flood. They said this was estimated to be a 75-year flood event. And it is flooded all the way out into the upland because they said this is a crested wheatgrass plant right here that only grows in the upland. So our creek, it's kind of hard to see the hula hoop tree. There's the snag and there's that pyramid shaped bush. But this is our creek right here, but it's out on the floodplain. February of 96, April, 2 months later. Now the photo point has shifted downstream a little bit. There's a hula hoop, there's the snag. It shifted downstream because they had to explain why did the creek widen back up? Well, beavers had moved into the area and attempted to dam the creek. It's become that stable of a perennial creek that the beavers moved back. But we still have good vegetation, good water flow. Everything is healthy. Lots of vegetation for cattle grazing down here. October of 96. This is about when the cattle would probably be turned in. They're going to run to this riparian area and they're going to be grazing down here. Not much to graze up here on the side slopes. 2001, another drought year. But again, those roots follow the water and it's going to strengthen up and actually help raise that creek up off the bottom. Here's 30 years later, hula hoop tree, snag, 30 years. And no diesel smoke was expended in the correction of this creek. A change in grazing management is all it took. Now let's look at a cross section of the creek. This is the way it looked in 77, mostly dry, a little bit of water right there in one spot, rock bottom. Here's that vertical bank we saw on the left. And then this is all the way across the creek to the other side. Now, if we go forward, here's 1983 when that first bit of water was really flowing. The water was right here. But all of this is sediment that's been deposited. This is floodplain building up. And here it was in that drought year of 2001, smaller channel, but look at the sediment that continues every year to build up. What's also interesting, if you look at the bottom of that rock, 88 feet, look at the bottom of the creek channel, 90 feet. It's raised up 2 feet off of that rock bottom in 30 years. Well, in 77, 87, 89, about 24 years. So the creek made drastic improvement on its own. And it's back to being a blue ribbon trout stream. And again, a change in grazing management. They removed the hindrance, the problem. They removed the problem, fixed it, And now this led to better management. Here's another creek somewhere out in one of the western states. I can't remember which one. I don't know what these are, but I'm going to say those are plum bushes because you want to see them in the next photo. Look at this bald knob of clay right here. And look how wide the creek channel is. It's vertical, it's sloughing. From 1986 to 1996, there's the plum bushes again. 11 years later, this bald knob has got grass on it. Look, the creek again narrowed up. The riparian sponge is wider. So they changed the hindrance, whatever the problem was. Here's another one. You kind of have to look hard because of all these rocks. Right up in here, there's a V-shaped shadow that'll show up. But look at this creek channel. It's spread out, kind of wide, no vegetation. Maybe that's a grazing problem. In 76, 2 years later, there's that same rock. Notice the creek's becoming defined. It's building floodplains on either side. There's that same rock. And look at it again. What is that? About 12 years later, here's the creek. But it's a lot more stable now than it was. Changing management. So what are some of these hindrances that we talk about to riparian function? Farming, mowing, or grazing too close to the water is a hindrance. This is down in Hamilton County. I'm standing on a paved road on the ranch going to a party barn that's to the right. The entrance is way back to the left. The landowner likes to throw parties. They got a skeet and trap field and horseshoes and washers and, everything, barbecue pits. And he mows this or has the hands mow it to keep it pretty. That's in his eyes. What's interesting is this same landowner, see the deer feeder, see this fence back here, same landowner owns the land on the other side of the fence. Look at the creek's potential back there. That's what it could be. But because we're mowing, spraying, shredding, not plowing in this case, but we're doing all of that too close, we're actually harming the creek right here, trying to make it look pretty. So we've got to adopt train our eyes to what this creek really should look like. Grazing concentrations in creeks. I worked 14 years in Taylor County, and this photo is from Taylor County. It was after I left, not that I had anything to do with keeping this in good grass or anything. I just saying I went back after I'd left and saw this. But they put stocker animals in this little pasture, and it was way too much. They had grazed it down to tree roots, basically. Terrible situation. This is Salado Creek, west of Salado. This old cow's eating on indigo bush amorpha, which some references say is poisonous to livestock, but she was happily eating on it. But at this grazing rate, that's not bad. But compared to that, that is bad. So, depending on how many animals you have, that determines how healthy the creek's going to be. This is from Limestone County, just north of Coolidge. I grew up at Coolidge. And this used to be a creek heading into the city lake that we got our drinking water when I was a kid. Now it's been sold off, private ownership, high fence was put up, exotic animals brought in. And as I was going north, I happened to look over and see this fence pushed down by the flood debris. And that's why I stopped and turned around and went back. And I guess these animals, axis deer, were laying down when I went by first because I didn't even see them. But when I came back and stopped to take this picture, they were standing up. So too many animals of exotic deer, native deer, feral hogs is also a problem. Not just livestock. It can be wildlife and exotic livestock like feral hogs. That's a problem because they like to be down where the water is, where the shade is, and where the good vegetation is. And they spend a disproportionate amount of time down there in those riparian areas. This is, I think, Frio River, down the hill country, beautiful manicured landscape. Do you think they're going to leave any logs that wash up or any mud deposits? If this is just 100 feet and a mile of length, it's not going to be a problem. But if this is where they've got those little narrow tracks, 20, 30, 40 acres, and everybody's got 100 or 200 foot of this every 20 acres, now it's beginning to add up to quite a bit of land. And it can weaken the health of that creek. These bald cypresses are very stable, but there's nothing left, nothing else to hold that creek. This is Salado Creek. This is the golf course on Salado Creek. And I always joke that this guy on the front end loader's got the most stable job in the county, because this golf course has got a little old road just out of the photo here behind me. And on that road is for the golf carts to get across. And they put 4 little tin horns. They look like about 24-inch diameter tin horns to let the water go through so they could drive the golf carts over that road. But look how wide the creek is. When you try to force all that water into 4 24-inch tin horns, you're going to have a lot of slowdown of the water and resulting deposition of sediment. So every time it floods, golf course manager calls this guy, says, come get that gravel out of the creek. It looks ugly. We don't like it. Well, this is public water, and they didn't have a permit. And Texas Parks and Wildlife fined the village of Salado for mining sand, gravel, or marl from public waters without a permit. And I was back through there. Always, anytime I was down in that area, I'd try to stop and take pictures of Salado Creek because it's so beautiful. But I saw this sign, Texas Parks and Wildlife has approved removal of rock. So they eventually got a permit. But artificial manipulation of the banks, removal of sediment is not good. The creek needs that sediment. The hindrance was that little golf course bridge with the tin horns. That was holding back the sediment. And excessive vehicle traffic in riparian areas since 2007, when a state law was enacted to prohibit the driving of motorized vehicles in the public waters of Texas. You no longer legally can do this. But prior to 2007, there were many Jeep clubs and four-wheel drive clubs that would meet and drive up and down these riparian areas, put them in four-wheel drive and go, churning up a lot of ground, a lot of country, not letting vegetation get started. You had gear oil leaking out, transmission fluid leaking out, lots of pollution. But since 2007, they're not supposed to do that. Removal of large dead wood and downed trees. You see a cut stump right here. This is the San Antonio River south of San Antonio, and creeks process this wood and they will incorporate it into the water, into the sediment below the water, and it becomes not just like rebar and concrete, but like you were burying I-beams in concrete. It stabilizes the creeks. If your house is right above this, you could take a few of them out, but this doesn't need to be cut up and down the entire creek or river. Excessive recreational foot traffic. We can love a creek to death. That's a problem. We need access to creeks. I don't know where this photo was taken. I found it on the internet, but it shows what we were trying to say here. We need access to the creeks and rivers for people to enjoy the outdoors, enjoy nature. But the way the cattails are on either side, that's limiting people's access. So give them access points, but don't let them just use all of it. And that's a healthy way for public fishing to be managed. Excessive alluvial pumping, withdrawals of the creeks and rivers. If you put a big irrigation well right next to the Brazos River and put a, V8 motor on a 200 gallon per minute well pump, and you pump water out of that, basically you're pumping water out of the Brazos River, even though you're pumping it out of a well, you're in the floodplain, that can create problems for the plants. It leads to a loss of vigor. These are switchgrass plants that are very kind of yellow-green. They're weakened. Here's some spikerush back here that's also not the deep green color we normally see it. They're getting dried out because of a lack of water from excessive pumping. Here's a bridge in the Metroplex built. A subdivision was built there on the left in this upper photo, and the engineers decided that they needed another road out of the back of that subdivision. So they hired or told the city engineers, you need to build us a bridge that we can, carry traffic out of there. So the engineers built a bridge that had 6 boxes, but look at what the original creek bank looked like. It was narrow. One of these boxes is about the size of that creek. So the creek decided, I don't need that much space. I'm going to use this one box right here as the channel to flow water through. I keep hitting that button. And I'm going to fill up all these other boxes. And that leads to problems with, now these boxes are half full and the city doesn't think it'll flow water, so they got to go down there and clean it up. What they should have done was built one box down here in the channel, the same size as the channel, and then built smaller boxes like this up on top of that one. And now the creek doesn't even know a bridge is there. Water's flowing through it just like it always has. Burning in riparian areas. This is from the wildfire in Palapino County in 2011. We shouldn't be burning in these riparian areas. We think of them as bands of green separating the water from the uplands, but we should think of them as bands of gold because they are that valuable to a property. And they will grow back, but we've lost, you saw button bush earlier that was 5 or 6 feet tall. Now it's just a couple of feet tall. It's having to regrow from basically ground level. So all of these plants will come back, but if we get another hard flood, this is still ash right here. It's not sediment, that's ash that's collected. If we get a hard flood, it may wash this more so than it would have before because there's less riparian vegetation. And then introduced exotic plants like elephant ear. One landowner along Salado Creek in town planted elephant ears along the creek. And now those elephant ears have spread at least 1.5 miles down. That's as far as I could get to on the roads. I'm sure it probably is further down. That Salado Creek dumps into Little River, which empties into the Brazos River. So if there are elephant ears in Bell County or going down toward College Station in the Brazos River, they might have originated right here in Salado. And then giant reed, Arundo donax, another bad problem plant in our riparian areas. We need to keep those out if we can. So to sum it all up, the creeks can heal if we give them time and good management, and if we remove the hindrance that causes the problem. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm going to stop sharing and see if we've got any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Ricky. I actually don't see any questions in the chat.
We had one question early on, and it was a request for Ricky's email address, which Alan Lusk was kind enough to post. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I need to remember to put that at the end of these presentations. But you do need to try to get that handout that has all of the plants on it, very informative on what kind of plants you need to be managing for. It's a work in progress. We tweak on it every now and then. A lot of times we'll take comments, that you think, well, this one plant ought to be scored a little better. It's one of the most stable plants I've got. We'll look at that and we might go from a 6 to a 7 on that plant. So we like to have interaction with folks on it.
And Ricky, we did have a comment that was appreciating how much the handout added to our understanding of the discussion.
Yep. The stability rating definition, wetland indicator definitions are at the bottom of that page, so that's helpful. It's a good little publication.
There's also been a question about the longer presentation, when and where, basically. I think we're just at the discussion stages, so it's a little premature to try and set a date.
Yeah. What it's about, the Natural Resources Conservation Service for about 15 or more years has offered these workshops. I was covering the vegetation part, the intro to riparian, and we had an engineer, Kenneth Mabin, who retired 5 years ago or so, and he was covering the geomorphology part of the talk. It's an expanded 3-hour session over what we covered tonight. And when he retired, the soil scientist in Weatherford that I worked with, he took over that part, and we did those workshops 2 to 4 a year. And we'll be willing to do them again once we can meet in public again and in groups. It takes about 3 hours in the morning. We have lunch, and then we go to a nearby creek, and we've scouted them out ahead of time. We know where to go, where to talk about. Once we get to the creek, I talk about vegetation. John talks about the erosion deposition of the creek. And we rotate. Everybody gets to see both sessions. That takes a couple of hours in the afternoon. We like to do those during the growing season, either April, May, or September, October. Probably be more likely September, October before everybody can get together. But if y'all want to host one of those, we'll probably, I just have to get with John, but I'm sure he'd be willing to do it. And we'd be glad to put one of those on.
I think we can take that up for discussion, and it's a great idea. We've also had a couple of questions about whether you present to cities on managing their waterways, and whether covering things like creek damage in urban environments.
Well, this was originally developed in rural areas using rangeland, grazing lands. You can see there's some overlap into the urban areas, but we gave a presentation on DFW airport grounds one time. We have given some in the DFW area and invited anyone. It's free to come. So, but as far as, we did do one for the city of the village of Salado one time, invited landowners plus as many of the city administrative people as could get there. But urban areas are slightly different in that it's hard to remove that hindrance. If you got excessive water coming in because of a 300-acre subdivision or a shopping center, and it's mostly runoff from asphalt and concrete, there's not a lot that can change that. So they're harder to restore. So it's a little harder to deal with, but the same facts apply. Maintain the vegetation as healthy as you can. If you can slow the water down any way at all with some, upstream little pools or ponds that are off the creek, but up in the watershed, that would help. But anyone would be welcome to come.
Thank you. There's also a question. Do you have, I'm not sure what the suggestions would be, but do you have suggestions on invasive plants like privet that are clogging the creek?
Well, the privet comes from misguided belief that it's a good landscaping plant, and the seeds it produces, the berries, wash down into the creeks and rivers and spread drastically. Down in the, let's see, the Central Texas Master Naturalist chapter works on a lake out west of Belton. Stillhouse Hollow, I think, is the lake. And there's a park, native plant park there. And they go in and they use a cut stump method where they cut the chainsaw off or lop and shear off the stump, leave it 4 inches tall or so, and then they paint the stump with a chemical to kill it. And it's repeated. You have to come back and probably do some more in the area. That's one method. It's very adept at sprouting off cut stumps if you don't put the chemicals on it. So you can't just cut it down or mow it. It'll come right back. But if you use a chemical, they are seeing success with it. And I don't remember the chemical, but it can be found. We can contact the county agent and find that chemical.
I think that's all the new ones. There's Joanne, I noticed you forwarded a message from Barbara Fleischman. I would recommend an email to cover that. That's a very detailed and very personal question. So if you need Ricky's help on that, perhaps a direct contact would be better than in this forum.
I'd welcome to talk to him. Yep.
Okay, well, our next meeting is April the 12th, also a Zoom meeting. Our